First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here today and to present you my book, Truth Bias. As you see, I've titled my presentation Truth Bias in a Post-Truth World, the Bad and the Good News. And this means that the evidence, the findings that I will be presenting today are both encouraging and discouraging as far as the fight against disinformation is concerned. Just to say that could you make me a sign? Because I might be a bit out of time.
So I'll give you a sign 10 minutes before and 5 minutes before the end of your talk.
Okay. Yes. So like any decent presentation on fake news and disinformation, I will start with the truism that we arguably live in a post-truth era where we, largely thanks to the internet and the social media, we are very frequently faced with false content, misinformation and fake news. And in this context, especially since what I see as the two seminal real-world events that like brought these terms to the center of public debates and the center of many research agendas, that is the 2016 US elections and the Brexit referendum. There has been a lot of research, and rightly so, on what interventions work best, as Anastasia showed before. The big debate, the big question in the literature. But less attention has been focused on what is the impact of misinformation in the first place. So, how does it affect people, and are people, prone to believe it? So the research that I have conducted and presented today is more aligned with this second type of question. So basically, the initial idea was to try and understand how people process and validate information that they encounter, and more specifically, whether they are prone to believe it or able to disbelieve it if they have reasons to do so. So if they have reasons to disbelieve the information. Just a disclaimer to say that so part of the work is old work that I did in my PhD. So just to say that this started well before 2016, where this whole discussion about misinformation really expanded. Just to bring some theoretical, I don't know where is this small window. I hope it doesn't. No.
That's fine.
Sorry about that.
Emergency button.
Okay. Like if we look at the broader literature, there are basically two accounts that are to a large extent opposing or going in opposing directions. So there is on the one hand what I quite simplistically call the gullibility account, which is largely based on dates back to Spinoza's epistemology. And there has been seminal work by the famous psychologist Dan Gilbert in the 90s on this. I mean, their research was largely inspired by Spinoza's argument. And they proposed the quite radical position that belief is actually part of the comprehension process. So from a cognitive point of view, whenever we have to understand a certain piece of information, we necessarily first have to believe it. And then we can eventually disbelieve it, but only if we have enough cognitive resources. And in any case, disbelief is cognitively secondary to belief. So, there is this belief is necessary, is a necessary part idea in this account. On the other hand, there is research in two related disciplines, like psycholinguistic research and evolutionary theorizing, And basically, what linguists have shown in the past few decades is that when we compute the meaning of a sentence, we simultaneously take into account information at various levels. So we don't only, we're not only based on syntactic and semantic information, but we also bring into the comprehension process background knowledge and contextual information. And so in this, from this perspective, from the psycholinguist perspective, it's hard to argue that, as Gilbert argued, that we will be, ignorant, or we would ignore information that would signal that a certain piece of information is false. So, the idea is that if we look at how a linguistic processing happens, it's hard to imagine that that people are by default or prone to believe information. And then, in a similar lines, evolutionary theorizing, prominently put forth by Sperber and colleagues, has it that if, exactly because linguistic communication has rendered us so vulnerable to deception, to people who want to deceive us, manipulators, if linguistic communication has perpetuated and is here with us today, it's exactly because we must have been able to develop some mechanisms, some cognitive mechanisms, what they call mechanisms of epistemic vigilance, that protect us from deception, from false content. So in this view, again, people and information consumers would be alerted to the status and the truth value, basically, of information. So with our studies, we first started to we first tried to disentangle these two accounts, and we started by there is a big question of how do you test whether people are prone to believing information, each of us has, as was argued a bit before, so truth is not easily identified. It's not easy to define what qualifies as true information, what qualifies as false information. So we thought that the strictest, in a way, test of the idea that people are prone to believing would be to present novel information, so information on which people did not have any prior knowledge, and to tag it explicitly as either false or true. And yeah, just to say that this paradigm was largely inspired by Gilbert's and Cohen's work. And to make this a bit more realistic as a task, so the presentation of explicitly true and false information, we integrated this information into crime reports. So our participants listened to two crime reports, one about a perpetrator, let's call him Etienne, another about a second perpetrator called Dimitri. Each report was narrated by a female and a male speaker. So we had these two speaker identities. And people were told that the one speaker, in this example, the female speaker, was providing truthful information, whereas the second speaker was providing false information. So basically, this was our way to explicitly signal the truth and falsehood of the information in the two reports. Now, there was one important similarity and one important difference across the two reports. The similarity was that in both cases, the true information described a very similar armed robbery. So objectively speaking, the crimes were quite similar in nature. The big difference was that the false information was aggravating in the one report and attenuating in the other report. So whereas the false information in Etienne's report made him look like a violent drug addict, was like repeated offenses, the false information in Dimitri's report made him look as an otherwise good family guy who had some good reasons to commit a robbery. And in order to assess to what extent people believe, because belief is a big question. What does it mean, and how do you actually measure it? So we used basically two measures. The first one was designed to understand the impact that the false information had on people's judgments, on people's perceptions. So we asked each participant to propose a prison term from 0 to 10 years for each of the two perpetrators. The second measure was a measure of participants' memory of the truth value of the information. So we presented verbatim statements taken from the reports, consequent memory tests, and so participants could see true and false information taken from the reports, and they would have to classify it as either true or false. And what we were specifically interested in here was the error rate. So the comparison between the false information that people would misremember as true, versus the true information they would misremember as false. And then, in a first study, we also tried to assess the role of distraction in this paradigm. And this was largely owing to, as I mentioned, Hilbert's seminal work, who basically, in order to show that belief is a necessary step in the process.
Sorry about that.
No worries. They run studies to show that basically when people are cognitively depleted or distracted, they have a higher tendency to believe basically explicitly false content. So basically their account was largely based on showing that distraction makes people more gullible. So in a first set of studies, we tried to look into this idea. So we also included a distraction manipulation. And for example, in one study, one group was distracted. They had to accomplish a simultaneous task while listening to the reports. That is, we asked them to count how many times does the verb to have appear in its report. Whereas the other group was undistracted, served as a control group. So let's look at the results. Basically, what we see is that in both groups, the proposed prison term was harsher for the falsely aggravated perpetrator compared to the falsely attenuated perpetrator. And quite crucially, this was the case regardless of distraction. So in our studies, distraction did not have any impact. So there are two components in this. Yeah, I'm going to talk about this in a while. Let me first talk about the memory results, which largely mirror what I showed, in the sense that we see that, for example, people, thank you, misremember up to 10% of the false information, of the true information as false, but they misremember up to 30% of the false information as true. And again, although overall the distracted group had an overall lower accuracy in the memory tests, this was across true and false statements. So basically the difference between the error rates was not significantly different across the two groups. So what we came to conclude with these findings is that people basically by default tend to believe information that we process. They exhibit what we came to call this truth bias. And quite crucially, this truth bias in our studies was found to be there actually, even if people are not distracted. So even if people can fully focus on the task of processing information and considering its truth value, we see that there is this default tendency. Now, we the next step, I mean, this is just one of the studies that we ran. We replicated the phenomenon in various other studies. But so the next natural step for us would be a bit like in the line of interventions, or how can we mitigate, or what factors could mitigate this bias. And the first thing that in this context we tried to test was to make people accountable for the prison terms that they propose. So we told, for example, people, and these were laboratory studies, not online studies. So we told some participants that they would have to orally justify the prison terms they proposed to the experimenter after they fulfill this task. And well, accountability did not play a role. So basically, I don't have the time to go into detail, but we replicated the same phenomenon even when people were made accountable for their judgments. Then, quite interestingly, we also replicated the phenomenon in a group of professional judges. So our reasoning was that professional judges are professional fact finders, so they must be used to actually process information that they can tag us through and then remain intact from this information. Unfortunately, this was not the case, so we again replicated this phenomenon in a group of professional judges. And that's so far the bad news in my presentation, so the discouraging component. But luckily, I also have some good news, because one of the factors that we tested proved to be efficient. And this factor was high personal stakes that we operationalized through financial incentives. So it was like a last resort of what on earth could make this phenomenon disappear. And we thought, okay, we're going to offer incentives to participants to see if their responses are more accurate. So we first replicated, found some indicative evidence that high, like an incentivizing manipulation has an impact, a negative impact on bias. And now I'm going to present you the more expanded study on the effects of personal stakes, which actually involved 4 groups of people. So again, building on the same paradigm that I described before, so the crime reports with the judgment and the memory tasks. So we had one group who was incentivized on their judgments, and they were told, for example, that they would receive 5 extra euros if they proposed fair prison terms. And this manipulation took place before they had processed the reports. There was a similar group that was also incentivized for making correct judgments, but the manipulation took place after processing the reports, and the idea here was to understand if high personal stakes might come into play by changing the way people process information, or simply by making them correct their responses, in a post hoc way. Then there was a group that was incentivized before listening to the reports at the level of their memory. So they were offered incentives now for performing well in the memory test. And the idea for including this group was that we wanted to make sure that the effect of incentives was not specifically linked to one of the 2 tasks that people had to accomplish. So we were interested in seeing maybe potential differences between the judgments before and memory before groups. And then we had the control group, which was a comparison group. Now, what we see the first measure, so the judgments, we again find this discrepancy in the prison terms across the aggravated and the attenuated perpetrator. So again, participants proposed harsher prison terms for falsely aggravated than for falsely attenuated perpetrators. However, there was also an interaction in the sense that of the two groups that were incentivized before listening the information exhibited a smaller effect. So somehow this increased personal stakes reduced their propensity to believe the false information. And the memory results mirror this in the sense that, again, the truth bias was evident across all four groups, but it was smaller in the two groups that were incentivized before listening to the reports. Okay, so to conclude, what our studies show basically is that there appears to be a default truth bias in the way people process information. So there is a default tendency. And I mean, as a disclaimer here, of course, it's other things being equal, because there have been studies which show that when people have background knowledge, for example, they are less likely to believe certain information. So of course, there are going to be moderating factors. But other things being equal, there is this default truth bias. And why I think that this, the way I see this is interesting in all this context of the research that tries to mitigate the impact of misinformation in real life, is that and as Anastasia showed before, it's very important to be able to compare the various interventions and see which work more. But it's also important to take into account the absolute impact that misinformation may have, because what these findings suggest is that even if interventions are to some extent able to make people better at detecting falsehood, for example, falsehood might still have an unintended consequence on the way people think. And secondly, as I showed, there seems to be something about high personal stakes in an information processing context that makes people better. But the question is how and if we can capitalize on this finding in order to fight misinformation in the wild. So, could it be that, for example, making people be more aware of the relevance of consuming false information, or I don't know, rendering the news consumption, for example, process more personally relevant for people, for users? Could this have an impact and a positive impact and be a weapon against? And yeah, and just thank you for your attention, and I would like to thank also my collaborators and former PhD supervisors, Politica and Infodemic.
So let's take 10-15 minutes for questions. Yes.
There's already a raised hand on the online.
Yes, I see Piero's hand. Well, let's take Simone's question and then we can go to Piero.
Yeah, thank you very much for the talk, very interesting. I tend to disagree on one conclusion that you make. So you say that there is a true bias, but actually what you find is that there is a tendency to misremember facts that are presented as false, but they are still presented. So if you take the true by repetition literature, we know that just because we are exposed to facts, we tend to believe those facts. But what has been recently described in that literature is that For instance, if you present the ecology within which those facts are presented, matters in judging exposed facts as true or false. For instance, or my colleagues demonstrated that if you presented those facts in the ecology of fake news, then you're more likely to judge those facts as false. So I'm not sure that what you find is evidence for a true bias.
Well, yeah, okay. So just to clarify that, yes, there was this memory effect, but there was also the effect on the judgments. So,
Yeah, but still, I'm not sure.
yeah, and
Sorry.
no, it's okay. I mean, that's the purpose of the workshop, right? To get comments and feedback and criticism. Yes, I am aware of that paper, and it was interesting to see actually that there is this ecology-driven malleability of the way we process and the way we interpret. Basically, when it comes to the illusory truth effect, it's about making inferences about perceptions, so like perceptions of fluency. I think it's an open question to see to what extent this, I mean, you know, that literature is not concerned with whether there is a higher tendency to believe false or true information. It's about perceptions. So I think it's an open question indeed to see how this might change in different ecological contexts. Just to say, we looked a bit into that by, for example, manipulating the ratio of true and false statements, because the whole idea behind this ecological interpretation of fluency perceptions is that by default, truthful information is more prevalent, and therefore people are entitled to, by default, believe in information because, you know, most of the time they are right to do so. So we, for example, used the context where the ratio of true and false information was 50-50, and it's still like the phenomenon still replicated. So I think it's a nice comment, but I think it's the, you know, there is still research that needs to be done to understand the counterintuitions. Yeah, thank you.
So Piero has a question?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, thank you, Myrto, for the nice presentation. With Folco, Carlo, Simone, and Tiffany, so we have a couple of experiments where we also use monetary incentives, and we do find a similar pattern. That's good news. I'm just wondering, so we're trying to understand why it works. Also, we try to compare, and Folco will present results on this. But I just want to have your impression. So, from what you said, one important thing we can do with your experiment is we can compare the distraction that you use in the first experiment and the monetary incentives, right? So even if it's not a direct comparison, we can say that the pattern is somehow similar. Is that correct? So inverse but similar. So the people who are incentivized is as if they behave as if the one that are not distracted in the first experiment. And second short question, do you have by any chance collected other information that can help reply to this question?
Yes.
We cannot hear you. You're muted.
Okay.
You can hear a typing when you're speaking.
Yeah, I know.
We'll deal with that.
Sorry. So I was saying that I'm not 100% sure I understood the analogy you made between the undistracted and the incentivized group. Can you repeat this?
Yeah. So I don't know if I got it correctly from your graphs, but it looks like the pattern is just the contrary. So what you get with people who are not distracted is the same as people who are incentivized.
You mean in terms of absolute like scores?
Yeah.
Yes, the truth is that we didn't look into this much because basically these were different populations. So the first study was among students, and it was run a bit ago, whereas the last study was run with online, an online sample provider. So I'm not 100% sure we can really look into the absolute comparison of the scores in this respect. But I do agree in one thing, that there may be, it's the stakes in a certain case where you have to validate information is like a continuum, and there is like the higher end of having very high personal stakes, and then you would be extra cautious, and then depending on other factors as well, you might exhibit lower interest or attention into the task, which might be the case, for example, in the distracted group, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you.
And concerning your other question on extra information, so I think one important point to keep about the incentivizing manipulation is that it seems to work when personal stakes are high at the moment you consume the information. But it wouldn't, for example, work, based on our findings, with debunking. So it wouldn't work, maybe not as much, if people have already processed the information. We have additional evidence for this, because in another study that I didn't present here, we distracted people while being incentivized, and basically that's made the effect disappear. So it seems to be something about the cognitive process, and the role of personal stakes in the processing at the time, but basically at the time you process the information. But I'm interested to hear what you found.
So next, Stefan has a question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I have a question or a comment, and I'm sorry if this was already discussed, because I missed part of the talk because of technical difficulties on my side. When you present the memory performance in general, I think there's always this distinction between somebody's ability to retrieve something and what is the response tendency or the bias today. And I was wondering to what extent techniques like signal detection theory or multinomial processing trees could be used in your paradigm to better understand the effect of the manipulation on the exact process. So I'll put a paper in the chat that you, I guess, can't see right now. Or maybe my question is more general. So what else can you do with the kind of data you have, going beyond looking at the proportion of responses, but applying some cognitive modeling to it? I would be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Actually, we've used signal detection theory analysis in one of our papers, and the difference does not seem to be at the level of response bias. So there seems to be something that has not to do with the way people respond, but it's at the more cognitive level. So it's about discrimination, basically.
But that's interesting, because that, I think, is not compatible with then saying that people have a truth bias, because that needs to be in the response tendency. If it changes people's ability to remember or perform in the task, that's not a bias. And I mean, maybe this has been discussed before, but there's this research from Christian Unkelbach showing that if you change the fluency of something, this impacts people's response tendency, which kind of is a way of measuring the truth effect or fluency-based truth effect. So I think this would be very important, and I think would be very convincing to show if it appears on the response bias or tendency or on the discrimination ability, because I think any claim about a bias needs to be on the response tendency, cannot be on the discrimination ability.
So I think, yes, I'm not sure I agree, because basically the response tendency would be that people by default answer in the questionnaire that anything is true. So I think that finding an impact on discrimination makes sense if we take that this bias operates at the way people encode the information in the first place. So, you know, if you encode the information by default as true, then this should indeed lead to like an impaired discrimination, but not necessarily. But I would be interested to hear more about this. I mean, I think it's an interesting interesting question. Thank you.
Yeah, I was interested in knowing more about the study involving a real judge and the fact that accountability didn't play a role.
Yes.
And yeah, I wanted to know more about the stakes involved, because you know, if you are a judge and the life of a convicted person is involved, I mean, intuitively, I would suggest that it would be a higher stakes than finding reasons for, you know,
Yes.
for decisions.
Yeah, it's a very good point. I think you're right. I mean, I almost feel like I would like to repeat the study with incentivizing manipulation to see if it would change judges' responses. Because at the time we hadn't run the incentive studies yet. So our basic reasoning was based on expertise and experience, and that's why we expected judges to behave differently. Apparently, obviously they didn't. Now, is it an incentives issue? I mean, it could be. I don't know, but I think it's still interesting because, you know, we also felt that judges would have somehow this increased willingness to behave rationally in a way, like, you know, to show that they are acting in this task, and it wasn't. I mean, this type at least of incentive was not enough. So I think it's an open possibility that. You know.
But in the manipulation, it involved the same manipulation. It was not. It didn't involve real person, right?
No, it didn't involve real. I mean, it was, as I said, fictional crime reports, and obviously the task itself is not exactly what judges do. I mean, they don't listen to a report and then propose something. They study material a lot. So what I take as the most interesting finding from these studies that, like, you know, experience and expertise does not necessarily use this. Yes.
I'd like to make a philosophical point. I don't know how relevant it is, but generally in philosophy of language, it's assumed that a bias towards truth is a necessary condition for interpreting and understanding others. And then, of course, that will also go into remembering what you remember. So that would have nothing to do with incentives, etc. It's just how language is understood.
Yeah.
That's Davidson calls that the principle of charity. So I would expect people to take false beliefs to be true more often than the other way around. So do you consider that sort of preconditions of language and understanding in your?
Absolutely. And I mean, my thesis, because my background is in linguistics, so my thesis was interdisciplinary, and I borrowed from both, like, philosophy of language. Actually, the idea was that we wanted to somehow compromise the findings from various disciplines, because, as you said, like, it's in this line of research, it's expected that you trust and you believe. Other lines of research showed the opposite. So it's yeah, I think it's an important argument also from our end, like the way we believe this makes sense is that it is based on like the history and the evolution of how we came to communicate with each other and how language evolved, actually, because, you know, it emerged among small groups that were mostly cooperative. So of course these factors must have something to do with this. Yes. Thank you.
So in the end, we actually have plenty of time for these two sessions. So I would actually like to give the chance to Ulrich Hofrager, who had a question earlier. Would you like to ask your question now to the, in this case, the first speaker? I mean, you can say if you want to.
Yeah, I can.
Please.
In fact, I think it's more relevant for Anastasia, in fact, but maybe Myrto can also answer. So you can hear me, right?
Yes, we can hear.
Okay, good. Misinformation, and this is the topic of this workshop, of course, then immediately leads to information. And my question is, what exactly do we consider here as information? So one candidate is a fact. So on this day, this happened. But then we all know that why for most events, all people would agree, there may be some rare disagreements and some people may report different things, what they've seen, depending on their perspective or whatever. Minority, but it may happen. The second class or candidate is statistics, polls, surveys, experiments, or results of experiments. And here we all know that this hinges on operationalization and it hinges on sampling. And the third is causal attribution. So if someone says X is because of, or Y is because of X, or X leads to Y. Now, is this a fact? And can you misinform here? Or is this already a theory? And here we all know, being scientists, that scientists often debate what is the right causal explanation here. And then there is one theory and another theory. And often it's not a right or wrong question, but it's a question about applicability, about realm, about settings in the experiment. And it's often hard to decide with who is right. So did you, and now maybe I start with asking Anastasia first. Did you in your toolbox distinguish among these three categories? So what type of category are these experts talking about when they gave their recommendations about misinformation? What is information?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ulrich. This is a very deep philosophical question. So I see how you're thinking about information from a very different perspective, I guess, than we're talking about this more generally in the field or how even policymakers would approach this. But I really like your classification that, you know, so when we're talking about social media online, anything like a social media post is a piece of information. It can convey indeed information about something that happened in the world. It can convey information about opinion of the person who shares this, or they can relay opinion of other people and so on. And then this very interesting thing about causal links. Yeah, how do you explain how one thing leads to another? Of course, and I think if we like from this philosophical perspective, we can think even probably about even more sort of systematic understanding of what different types of information can be there. But this, I think, quite basic distinction between facts and opinions is something that is quite often used. Also, when people are like taught digital media literacy skills, right? So no, I cannot say that I've never, at least from my experience, encounter that sort of approach to information pieces in misinformation research. But maybe I'm wrong, right? Like I'm saying from my experience, I'm not sure. But if we like look at what is considered harmful misinformation that is addressed by policy, that usually be information about what? Elections or information about COVID, right? About vaccination. There we can, like there, as you say, scientific findings themselves entail a lot of uncertainty. There is quite, and this is often actually is brought up by the argument even by the other side, right? By people who want to use this inherent uncertainty of scientific research to misinterpret how it works, to say, look, there is no sufficient evidence. If it's not 100%, we cannot trust this. I think probably debunking would be the closest one that would address something that you like along the lines of what you're thinking about, because they're usually addressing more directly the arguments and the claims used by science denialists. So there, I would think it depends really on the claim. They usually would, but I think in their approach, they mostly talk about facts and scientific explanations and theories. Yeah, I'm not sure if it's a satisfactory answer to your question, but I do agree that it would be a useful actually approach to think of how we can address this different types of misinformation from this perspective. Yeah, I don't know if you have any pointers to the literature that explores this.
If you allow me, I would like to ask a follow-up question. So maybe for these different categories that I mentioned, and this list is maybe not complete. So facts, statistics, and theories, or events, statistics, and theories. How can we determine whether some information is misinformation? And when it comes to events that happens here, I would like to hear witnesses. So I have been there, and I can say on this demonstration, there have been around 500 people. This is then maybe what the police says, and the organizers talked about 5,000, and maybe some witnesses could help you. But when it comes to statistics, and here I said it often hinges on operationalizations and on sampling, here I would like to have discussion among experts, among scientists, among researchers, and even more so for theories. When it comes to causal explanations, I want to have debate. I want to have argument. I do not want to have a ministry of truth. And here I have this Orwell dystopia that someone says, okay, this is information, this is not information, or this is misinformation, and then there's a ban on the internet or on social media platforms. Here I would go in the opposite direction, have an open discussion where everyone could say his or her opinion, and not one person says or one institution says this is allowed and this is not allowed to mention public.
Yeah.
And this
No,
may depend on my categories, right? For different categories, we may have different filters. But what's your stance?
I agree with you. And I think if we would just talking about from policy perspective, usually the main focus would be on what you call factual information, which is of course the easiest case in this place, in this array of yours. Then it comes to statistics. There is a way to misrepresent statistics. There's a way to lie with statistics, of course, or use, many misinformers use unpublished results, like retracted results from scientific publication to then argue their case. I think here, like the broader public understanding of how science works is even important, yeah, so that they are not misled. I, like in my experience, never heard of any attempts to silence a productive debate. I think then it comes to really enacting intervention. It's really about information that is proven by independent fact-checker bodies to be false, right? And if the state of the evidence is inconclusive, I think that's already a good sign not to intervene, right? I think nobody wants social media platforms to make decisions, or even state regulators to make decision of what is true or not. And that's a big problem, because at the end, if nobody wants to make these decisions, then harmful misinformation continues proliferating, right? Because we are here debating how, like, all these difficult categories. Yeah, so that's by no means is an easy question. But I think practice shows that actually, if you look at the recent policies, there is a certain common sense approach that's been implemented based on independent fact checkers work, based on independent organizations such as VHW, or based on independent journalistic organizations. Sometimes just also a lot of values come into play. So yeah, but great questions, thank you. I know maybe somebody else wants to comment on this. I don't want to sort of dominate the debate, because the question is so broad that
And so Myrto,
Thank you.
if you want to comment on this as well.
I mean, I'm not sure I agree with what Anastasia said. I think it's a huge question at the moment.
So I think we have a few minutes for one last question, if anyone. The audience. Volker, yes.
Just a couple of remarks about this very interesting discussion. I think one of the main cornerstones of the debate here is about independence, right? And how much governmental agencies and parties that have stakes into the debate somehow, chime in, giving their own side of the events of what happened in several situations. And I think that's kind of the most problematic part of the vetting of information, because that governments, agencies, and so forth, they do have interests with it. So it's also, it would be interesting to put more focus on how institutions can be really independent in order to assess information and disinformation. But that's just a very general comment. The other thing wasn't related to the discussion, but more about the toolbox. Just a remark, since Anastasia asked for input. I really like these dynamic tables. I'm a fan of dynamic tables. So I kind of feel that it would be very interesting to produce some sort of visual representation of this toolbox, just to make it more intuitive. And I think this will also broaden the audience that can access this information and actually make it more intuitive. Just this were my remark.
Yeah, that's great. If you have any more, like, would you, for instance, are you thinking visualization of the toolbox of the tables themselves, or are you thinking more along the lines of what I mentioned, creating a separate public-facing toolbox? It just sort of incorporates information that is relevant for the public and omits all the others, or what? Or you thinking like visualizing the effect sizes? Or
I was thinking of all of these things, actually.
okay.
Or more user-friendly interface with like small mock-ups of these interventions, or was somehow this kind of overlaps with what Philip is doing and we're doing at the Processual Design Network. That's a different story. But also, we'll talk about this later.
Yeah, sure.
But also, yeah, I mean, also the magnitude of the effects. That's something. If you can, translate this into something comprehensible to a lay audience, I think would be one of the most massive achievements that this literature can produce.
Yes, yeah, definitely. No, this is something on our agenda, and we're gonna tackle this issue. As I mentioned, it's not an easy one, but we definitely will find a solution. And something also that Stefan reminded me that we should emphasize when we talk about our toolbox. Listen, so this is not a meta-analysis or a systematic review, right? This is a new type of meta science approach, which is called expert review. That's, for instance, was implemented by John Cook and Steve Lewandowski in their debunking handbook. So this is more an overview of the field of selected interventions, but this is not, by no means includes all possible publications and all possible evidence for interventions. So this is a toolbox of selected tools based on expert opinions and advice. But I know there are also some projects that are exploring meta-analytic and systematic reviews approaches, more classical ones to this topic, and apparently they're also in the pipeline. So I think we'll see more of this research, which I can only welcome. I think it's massively needed by the field. I think there's always comes a point in the field development there. Just producing one paper after another is great, but there needs to be some sort of evidence accumulation process happening in parallel, because it then informs the design and further intervention research. Also sort of shows what is missing from it. Yeah, thanks.
Great. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Myrto, and thank you, Anastasia. We now take a break. We have a half an hour break, so we will come back at 11:25.